Hi, everyone. Good to be with you this afternoon. Thank you. Thanks for joining. We've got two fantastic speakers with us. I'm really particularly pleased about this because look, don't tell anyone, but the best ever job that I had was not my current job, which is chief exec of Big Issue Invest. My best ever job is when I was program director environment for a large environmental grant maker and social investor, and it was just fantastic. So I'm particularly pleased to be joined by Lina. Of course, I can be no less pleased that we are joined by James from Big Society Capital because he's the other half of my life, being in social investment. So two amazing speakers. Lina, do you want to introduce yourself and your organization and what brings you here today?
Sure. Thank you so much. Delighted to be here. Hello, everybody. My name is Lina Constantinovici, and I'm the founder and CEO of Innovation 4.4. Our mission as an organization is to accelerate the deployment and commercialization of solutions that the world most needs. A lot of our work focuses on oceans because it is such a key topic and a really important area of work. And so we do a lot of different kinds of work in the ocean space. We have an ocean prize to make ocean innovation around the world more visible. We also have educational programs like a VR scenario we're launching and so on. And also we work with governments, investors, and corporations to accelerate innovation. I'm also a partner in a couple of funds that invest in the space. And I have the honor of serving on the steering committee of the World Ocean Council for the Roundtable on Investing, through which we bring the ocean investment community together to collaborate and advance the space.
Fantastic. Thank you. And James, if you could kind of introduce yourself and your
All
role
right.
at
Okay.
Big Society
Gotcha.
Capital.
Thanks.
Sure. It's a real pleasure to be here and to meet Lina and to talk to Daniel. My name's James Westhead. I'm head of engagement at Big Society Capital. Big Society Capital is the UK's leading social impact investor, but we have a specific mission, which is to grow the amount of money invested in tackling social issues and inequalities in the UK. And we do this by investing from our own balance sheet, but also by enabling others to invest for impact too. And to give you a sense of this, Lina, in the UK, since 2012, when we launched 10 years ago, the social impact investment market has grown tenfold to nearly 8 billion now, as we measure it. And the capital that's being invested in that way is financing social purpose organizations, tackling everything from homelessness to mental health to fuel poverty. And Daniel's organization would be a key one of dozens of key partners for us in managing the funds that ultimately go into social ultimately invest in social purpose organizations that deliver that impact. So that's our role. And sometimes people call us, not really correctly, a social finance wholesaler or a fund of funds. So it's we are investing in the into the fund level, not directly into the enterprises, but our mission is really to grow the ecosystem. So we're working with government, with other investors right across the system to really try and grow the system.
Fantastic. Thank you both. So let's dive into some questions. So Lina and James, talk to me a little bit about sustainable development and how it fits on the spectrum of blended capital. And if we can start with maybe a couple of examples around the use of blended finance to meet sustainable development goals, I think that would be a good kickoff. So Lina, over to you first.
Sure. There's some great examples in Europe recently that I'll share about SDG 14 or investing in the blue economy. The European Union has launched a fund through its European Investment Fund mechanism and European Investment Bank mechanisms, $500 million fund to stimulate VC funds in the ocean space, so early stage funding for companies in the space, and to incentivize more funds to launch in Europe, which has been a really great mechanism. As a result, I don't have the latest count, but I believe at least a dozen new funds have launched so far and are continuing to launch. In terms of the European Environmental Bank, it's committed 2.5 billion between 2015 and 2023 for lending to ocean projects. Other examples, Portugal has a number of programs at the national level to incentivize the blue economy, blue clusters, and investors to participate in the blue economy. I'd like to just give a little bit of to step back and just share a few facts to remind us, why are we talking about the blue economy? Why is it so important? And why the fact that it's the least invested SDG is something to take note of and address. $3 trillion of our economic activity globally depends on our oceans. 50 to 80% of the oxygen we breathe depends on our oceans. And 98% of the carbon ever produced on our planet since its beginnings is sequestered by our oceans. So it is critical to our economic survival, to our physical survival on the planet as a species. So this is why I think John has put together this session and why we're having this conversation. So I think it's important to put this conversation about blended capital in that context and remind us, as the saying goes, that our economy is a fully owned subsidiary of our ecology. And since the oceans represent 70% of our planet, it's a pretty important component of that.
No, absolutely. And James, just picking up that link to catalytic capital, it's if you want to come into a new space, get a guide, get a lever, or get a bit of risk protection. Can you kind of talk to us about catalytic capital and how it can work in the context of the SDGs?
Well, I think even more specifically, it's talking about blended finance, which is related to, but slightly different from catalytic capital. So I think what's really interesting about this conversation, it's fascinating to hear Lina's big picture, because what you're saying is that we've got a massive problem that we need to think much more long term about. And we're currently thinking short term. We haven't got the sort of structures in place to enable investors, or we haven't had until recently, to enable investors to really invest longer term. And it's very analogous to the picture that I was describing about the UK society sort of 10, 20 years ago. In other words, why would in private capital investors invest in tackling problems from homelessness through to diabetes? It wasn't something they were familiar with, in much the same way as they're not familiar with investing in the blue economy, as you rightly put it. So what we did over the last decade to contribute and accelerate that growth here in the UK was create blended finance structures. So in essence, that's combining, as you'll know, the different types of capital to make the risk reward profile more accessible for larger scale investors. And that's brought money in. So we, over the last decade, have probably invested region of 150 million into blended finance structures in the UK. We've helped set up new systems. So there's a separate intermediary called Access, which we helped create back in 2016, which was really to try and enable this bringing together of philanthropic or government capital with private capital. And that has really been transformational for blended finance in the social sector here in the UK. So I'm just positing here, but similar things will be needing to happen in the blue economy to enable blended finance to play that critical role of bridging the gap so that investors can come in at greater scale to tackle the longer term issues that you really outlined very compellingly.
Yeah, and Lina, it's easy in the face of a big problem to feel powerless, even if as a private individual with substantial wealth, a substantial trust and foundation, even a public body, we can feel small in the face of these large challenges. So how can we all work together to ensure that investment is mobilized for the oceans?
Yes, I think aligning capital, aligning resources of all kinds to achieve these goals are critical to getting to the goals that we're working towards in the time frame that we have. And that last bit is really important in the time frame that we have, because we are on a time schedule in terms of achieving these outcomes. I'd like to go back briefly to something James said. He mentioned briefly the gap. So I'd like to highlight the numbers around how big the gap is for funding ocean solutions or the blue economy. Reports show that in order that this gap for ocean funding is 149.02 billion annually, meaning that in let's see the numbers in 2017 at the UN Ocean Conference, 25.5 billion was committed to SDG 14. So that means of the intended goal, which is 174.52 billion. So a shortfall of nearly 150 billion in terms of the difference between funding committed to SDG 14 and what is actually needed. So we are 6 times the gap in terms of current funding committed. On the other hand, if we do nothing, research has shown that by, let's see, I believe it's 2030, by 2030, that cost goes up to 322 billion annually to address mitigation. So the cost of doing nothing or of not reaching these goals, needed goals to address SDG 14, are considerable in the not too distant future.
So how what helps us get there?
One of the things that helps us get there is really building mechanisms to develop these partnerships between governments, philanthropists, investors, and so on. Family offices have a really important role to play. You asked the question earlier. While other types of investors may think in terms of quarterly returns or 5 to 7 year returns, families think in terms of legacy. And that's a really important difference when it comes to funding the kinds of solutions that the world needs right now. So aligning that visionary catalytic capital that family offices can provide with government mechanisms and great platforms and to make that happen, like Big Society Capital, for example, in the UK, like some of the mechanisms that the European Union is putting in place, and many other governments around the world, recognizing the critical importance of the health of our oceans.
James, big society capital, society absolutely part of the environment that holds it. Yeah, how will you approach this?
Well, the wider environment piece, it's something that I think we have, partly maybe driven by the name Big Society, be focused on the social issues in the UK over the last decade. But we've, although we have invested in community energy generation, in fact, we're one of the largest investors in community energy generation in the UK, but we're really now thinking very hard about what our role is going to be in on tackling environmental issues and ensuring a just transition, because these are no longer, as you suggest, Daniel, these are not separate. You know, social issues and environmental issues are coming very obviously into one, and the whole energy crisis has made that very, very clear. But it's not straightforward, and this is, I'm really intrigued by how Lina and her colleagues in that SDG 14 space are thinking about developing this out, and how investors can get involved, and what are the why, because I am a little bit puzzled, given the time pressure, why SDG 14 is a bit behind the other, so far behind all the others. Why are investors not investing more in this? Because I think I'm right in saying that it's, the oceans bluntly feed a quarter of the population of the world and employ a large, if you consider marine fisheries, it's something like 200 million people employed in marine fisheries. So that linkage between society, economy, and ecology couldn't be clearer. So I'm a little puzzled as to why we're so far behind with SDG 14.
Yeah, Lina, what gets in the way?
I think a lack of alignment around resources that exist to address this challenge, lack of understanding on the part of policymakers around the outcomes that are needed for oceans. There are many, also in terms of corporate innovation, most corporations have significantly reduced their R&D, internal R&D and innovation budgets. So in terms of sourcing innovations, let's say, for example, like sustainable packaging that could greatly positively impact the ocean if addressed appropriately. In other words, if substitutions are made for better solutions. So everyone has a role to play. And I think there's less clarity about what is needed, what the priorities are, and how to play a role in that on part of all stakeholders in my experience. I can give one specific example that I think is a great opportunity for blended finance, and that's plastic and waste in general, but plastic in particular on small islands. So small islands are constrained by space. We are currently working, this is a real example, we're working with the government of a Caribbean small island nation. They've run out of landfill. There's not a lot of land if you're a small island to build another landfill. Currently, they are shipping their plastic to Canada from the Caribbean. This is obviously suboptimal, not only from an environmental perspective, but economically, it costs a lot of money to ship this plastic to Canada. So not a great solution. So they're looking for technologies that can help them, that can help them have a different option than building another landfill and process all the waste, including the plastic, on island and not have to ship it. So they are making an investment because this is urgent, because the existing landfill is so overburdened from layers of methane, it's catching on fire, it's a health hazard, it's a hazard environmentally, etc. So there's capital to partner with the governments of those nations that are addressing their waste issues and particularly plastic issues, which, by the way, is most governments of the world. There are very few governments that have the appropriate solutions in place to address in an economically viable and environmentally sustainable way their waste issues. We're also, for example, working with the government of Romania. Romania has also run out of landfills in key large cities. They're currently paying $300 million equivalent in fines to the European Union, and also the existing landfills overburden, same as in the Caribbean, catching on fire. The fire department puts water on it, creates toxic sludge. It goes in the water table, in the rivers, in the agricultural lands. So there's a real opportunity around addressing the plastics issue in a really systemic way with resources that are aligned to bring in innovation and partner with governments to address this issue. And it's a global issue.
Thank you. We had a question in the chat from David Stead. He was asking how for example, a mid-sized telecom infrastructure company with damaging cables underwater could use blended finance to become more net positive, or seabed trawling. How does a seabed trawling company that's damaging ocean life, how do we address that? Bold, practical steps preferred was David's request. So thoughts, maybe Lina and James.
Sure, I'll start with the seabed question or component of the question first. As far as we are aware from our scientific advisory committee, there is no safe way to do deep seabed mining. Deep seabed mining damages the ocean for hundreds of years to come in the areas where the work is done. So we are not proponents of this as a solution to addressing our energy needs and other outcomes that this kind of activity may have. There are mechanisms through blended finance to actually disincentivize small island nations in particular that are in a really difficult position economically and often will grant rights to companies that are doing deep seabed mining because they don't have many other sources of revenue, of funding. And so if we can build blue bonds or other types of mechanisms that build value for these communities to disincentivize deep seabed mining and protect those areas, those are some of the kinds of conversations we're having with the president of Palau and other small island nations, for example.
James, any thoughts from you?
I mean, I think obviously what I don't know is the mechanisms that you would need in order to provide a solution. But what blended finance can do is incentivize capital to come in at scale. And so if you have, exactly as Lina said, if you're able to align a philanthropic funder or a government funder with a more commercially minded investor, then you can achieve a scalable solution to the problem. It's really only something like blended finance that might be able to do it in a situation where it's not immediately commercially viable. And you know, I can't get into the ocean example because I don't know enough about it. In the UK, in a similar, a comparable example of how blended finance works, just in a completely different environment. This is a real one. Just say you're Sports England, so the government sports body, and you want to have new gymnastics centres all over the country, but you only have a few £1 million, then you're not going to be able to achieve that through grant. But if you use that grant in a blended finance structure, and this is what happened a few years ago, we set up a £10 million fund, of which 2 million was provided in grant by Sport England, and the rest was provided by investors. So in the end, 150 new gym facilities were built instead of the 50 that might have been refurbished with just grant. So it's enabling all parties in this arrangement to achieve their goal. So the government agency achieves much more gym facilities. The investor gets their money back at the return that they want or the reduced risk, and the organizations get the gym facilities. So it definitely there is a very powerful approach here which can be used in many different situations.
So advisors, what's the role of professional advisors in helping donors and investors navigate this space? Nina, maybe to you. Oh, actually, James, I could see you were unmuting. So maybe to you, James, and then Nina to
Yeah, well, I
comment
was
on.
going to say that they have a really important role because, again, as Lina was saying, it's about bringing different parties together. So an advisor can play a really crucial role in the way that an investor can't. This is a team activity. Nobody can do it on their own. So you need somebody who's going to bring them together, whether that's a professional advisor or often sort of an advisory company that will provide that service. I think in reality, unfortunately, in this country, a recent report by the Beacon Collaborative, which Philanthropy Impact was involved with as well, was a report on individual impact investing. And one data point that they shared was that only 10% of professional advisors in this country actually talk to their clients about impact investing. So there is a massive, not only can they play an important role, and they should play an important role. Unfortunately, at the moment, they're not always playing that role. So we really need, I think, partly because there isn't yet the support and the frameworks in place, despite the work of Philanthropy Impact and others. There isn't quite the system in place to support advisors to really do this work effectively.
Yeah, Lina.
And just to build on what James has said, I think that there's a need with the generational wealth transfer, and there's a demand for this kind of advice and for products to go along with it. I think those are not meeting the demand yet. Just to give a little bit of a context, there's a 40 trillion generational wealth transfer. I think all know the numbers that the next generation is thinking differently about their wealth than the previous generation. One of the first things that the next generation inheritor does when inheriting the wealth is fire the existing wealth manager because they often don't feel aligned with their values around impact investing and deploying capital in a certain way. Because of this, about, I think it was 3-4 years ago, maybe 5 now, Morgan Stanley sent 7,000 of their employees to upskill around impact investing because the disparity between even the language to have that conversation with that next generation inheritor was presenting a barrier. So there's a lot of work to be done. I don't know the numbers for the UK as well, but based on what James has said, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of upskilling those who are in a position to make those recommendations and bring parties together around how to do that most effectively, what's needed, what the priorities are, and how to structure those kinds of collaborations in the most productive way.
Great, good, thank you. Look, thanks, Lina. Thanks, James. John, time is upon us. I should hand back to you to wrap up.
Thank you very much. The problem is really clear. This has been a brilliant discussion, and thank you for sharing that with us. Just a couple of quick things. We did some research with Gen Z and women of wealth and millennials, all wealth holders, so not just part of the families of wealth holders. They were very, very clear that they want to align their wealth with their values and their motivations. And there's other studies that show that it's just not them, but it's also the boomers who are starting to shift more and more into this. So there's hope from that perspective. I'd like to sort of ask each one of you for final words of wisdoms, but Lina, I'm going to just sort of ask you a bit of a question as part of that final word of wisdom. The problem's clear, and there's a lot to be done. Is there hope?
I think there's hope. I see examples of human creativity and ingenuity to solve these challenges, and our work is to remove some of the barriers to be able to do so. The solutions are there, and if we can bring awareness that raises the capacity to remove some of those barriers, then we might just get there.
Great, thank you. James, the shift in advisors is taking place. that 10% is true, but I think there is quite a bit of movement in terms of advisors supporting their clients on their donor journey. And I think with consumer duty, there'll be a shift in advisors being customer-centric and having to talk to young people and others about their values and stuff. So it's heading in the right direction. It was good to hear from Lina that there's hope. James, final words of wisdom.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is heading in the right direction. I'm very hopeful as well. I think my key reflection is it's not a zero-sum environment. I think investors and indeed their advisors should really start, learning, and don't be put off, but don't think it's complicated. Seek advice, and crucially, you can learn from others. There are so many people now, investors, advisors, others in this space who are keen to share their expertise and help each other. So I think it's a really collaborative environment, because ultimately we all share these goals, these SDGs, and I think that makes this a really exciting space to be investing in, working in. And my only other reflection is it's such a broad waterfront. If you are thinking of investing in these areas, it'd be good to early on clarify what your objectives are, because it's such a broad waterfront. You don't want to spread yourself too thinly. So those would be my final reflections.
Great, thank you. We're not only sharing this, but we're sharing the impact of non-action as well, as Lina has made very, very clear. Danyal, last words of wisdom to you, and thank you for sharing this.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Of all the sectors I've worked in, I found the environment to be the most amazing. It's jammed full of extraordinary people, deeply committed to bringing about environmental change in a positive way. So you find people who will be so generous with their time and their knowledge and their expertise to help guide us along this way. So the people are there. The best thing about saving the environment is that, as you were just saying, John, it's an inaction that we just have to stop messing it up. So if we stop mining it, if we stop trawling it, if we stop chopping it down, it regenerates. And there's a phenomenal regenerative capacity of natural systems that is working in our favor. So it's a system that works in our favor if we just give it a little bit of a break. And that's what investing can help us do.
I think it's important that people know where they can invest around this, whether it's philanthropy or impact investing or blended finances. So this has been brilliant. Thank you very much. Very inspiring and stuff. So thank you.